Hello, friends. Welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. This is a podcast of stories of devastating loss and grief and heartbreak and struggle, and stories of hope and healing and faith and, yes, even joy. Underlying every conversation is the hope we have in Jesus Christ, which makes it possible to not just survive the loss of a child, but to live well while we're waiting to see them again in heaven one day. You can learn more about our ministry and the free bereaved parent retreats we host by visiting our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. Welcome to episode number 272. Today we will continue with part 2 of my discussion with Ashley Opliger, wife, mom, author, speaker, and founder of Bridget's Cradles. In the first half of our conversation, Ashley shared her daughter Bridget's story, the pain of stillbirth, and the importance of validating the grief of parents who lose their babies. If you haven't listened to last week's episode, you'll probably want to back up and do that now. There's so much good stuff there. In today's conversation, Ashley invites us into the sacred moments surrounding Bridget's birth and the way God used a tiny hand-knit cradle, lovingly made by her mother, to bring comfort and dignity in the midst of heartbreaking loss. From that simple beginning, God birthed a ministry that now serves grieving families in all 50 states. Ashley also talks about her book, Cradled in Hope, why she wrote it to feel like a knee-to-knee conversation with another mom, and the scriptures that have anchored her through her personal grief journey. This portion of our conversation is both tender and inspiring, as Ashley reminds us that even in deep sorrow, God can bring redemption and purpose while we're waiting. So let's go back to the day that Bridget was born. When she was born, she was perfectly formed, but she was very tiny. Too tiny to be wrapped in a blanket. And I have to be honest, I've never thought about that before. I had 8-pound and 9-pound babies, big girls. And when I thought about that, just hearing you share your story, it just really touched my heart. So talk about that experience of having a baby that was too tiny to wrap in a blanket.
Yeah, so Bridget was only 13 ounces, so not even a pound. But she was fearfully and wonderfully made, so perfect. She had eyelashes and fingernails and peach fuzz growing on her head, like she was going to have dark hair, you could tell, and just so perfect, but very tiny and fragile. And so typically with second trimester losses, hospitals really didn't have a functional or dignified way to hold a baby. So a lot of times I was hearing that they would use a washcloth or a medical basin to hold these babies, or they would try to wrap them in the traditional blanket like they did originally with Bridget. And she just kind of got lost in that traditional receiving blanket. And through that, when we had this little cradle that my mom pulled out of her bag that she had made because God had inspired her to make this cradle, it just changed everything for us. And she was so perfectly just sitting in this little cradle, like laying there, and we were able to pick her up and bring her to our lips and kiss her and put her on our chest and hold her. And we had 24 hours that we could hold her in this little cradle. And both of our families came up, and the cradle gave them confidence to hold such a tiny, fragile baby. And we had a photographer come and take pictures of Bridget in her cradle and each of our family members holding her. And I'm so grateful that we had that, because those are our most prized possession, our only pictures of us with her on earth. And that cradle just really gave us that comfort. And then we ended up choosing to bury Bridget in the cradle inside her casket. And that also gave us a peace and comfort, just knowing that she was cradled in something that her Grammy made. And through this whole experience, when the hospital and the nursing staff saw the cradle, they said, "We've never seen anything like this for babies in the second trimester. And we would love to have more because we have 200 losses a year." And so my mom started knitting more cradles for that particular hospital here in Wichita, Kansas. And after a couple of months, we realized we were going to need more volunteers to keep up. And we also wanted to help the other local hospital here in Wichita. And so we had a news story And that news story was essentially just telling the story of what we were doing at our local hospital and trying to get some more local volunteers to come and help make more for our local hospitals. But God had other plans, and he ended up airing that story nationwide, and it got picked up on other TV stations. It ended up getting picked up on Yahoo News. It went viral online, and all of these hospitals across the country were saying, we need these cradles. And so I was back at work as a speech pathologist, and this ministry started taking off, and I felt very convicted that God was calling me to full-time ministry. And so I left my job, and it was about 6 to 8 months after Bridget was born, and have been doing full-time ministry ever since. And essentially, God created the ministry of Bridget's Cradles, and now we donate these tiny little cradles to over 1,600 hospitals in all 50 states. I think we just had 10 years of being a nonprofit. We've donated over 250,000 cradles and memory keepsakes since we started. And we're ultimately just trying to share the comfort of the cradle, but more importantly, the hope of the gospel with grieving families across the country and hopefully across the world with our podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Describe, if you will, what a cradle actually looks like. You said that your mom brought one. When she saw Bridget and saw the need, did she just go home and create this, or what happened there?
Yeah, so during my time on bed rest, I was hospitalized because I just had very heavy bleeding. And during a hospitalization, it was about a week before she was born, the doctors were saying, I don't think you're going to be able to stay pregnant much longer. The hemorrhage was getting bigger. Bridget was growth restricted. And they basically were saying, even if you do go into labor, I don't think she's going to survive birth. And they had given us a lot of different possible outcomes. And honestly, all of them were pretty not great news. And so we had a really hard time processing that as we were walking through my pregnancy and just dealing with trying to pray for the best possible outcome, but also simultaneously preparing for the worst. And that was just a really hard place to be. And so my mom, after that particular hospitalization, when the doctors were not giving us a very good prognosis, she went home and she was essentially trying to make a blanket for Bridget if she was born very early, which is what they were telling us was going to happen or was likely to happen. And so she made the blanket. And then once she made this tiny blanket and she made it mint green, because that was the blankie that I had as a baby, and I had a mint green walls, and we had planned to paint her walls the same color. So she had made the blanket and she thought, how would I swaddle such a tiny baby in this? And that's when God gave her the idea to knit the sides up and turn it into a cradle. And so she had actually packed it in her hospital bag and didn't tell me that she had made it, because we were still praying that that she would be full term. And so she just had it like as the worst case plan, and we had that. And when I went into labor, the hospital staff put her in, after she was born, in the regular blanket, and then my mom pulled the cradle out and we were able to hold her. And so that's how the original cradle came to be. But to describe what it looks like, so our cradles are knit and crocheted, and my mom's was knit because my mom is a knitter, but it's essentially somewhere between 7 and 10 inches long, if you can kind of imagine. And if you want to go to our website, bridgetscradles.com, you can actually click on who we are. And then there's a whole page about our cradles, the story behind the cradle, and then pictures of the cradles. So if I'm not doing the best job explaining it, there are a lot of pictures on our website to see them and to see little babies inside of them as well, because we do share stories on our blog of families who have received the cradles. But essentially, it is a little knitted cradle. Sometimes people will use the word boat, if you will, but essentially it just holds a precious baby inside. And then there's what we call a tapered blanket. And the the blanket tapers down to kind of match the shape of the cradle, but it's about 2/3 of the cradle so that essentially it would cover the baby's body and allow their little precious face to be visible. And that's so that families can have memorial photography taken. Because a lot of times babies that are what you would consider micro preemie, their skin is very fragile and it can be very bruised and red and swollen and sometimes bleeding or torn. And so the blanket just provides dignity to the baby.
Yeah.
And then there's what we call a memory keepsake attached to the cradle. And that is a little heart or square that was knit or crocheted. And that is meant for the family to hold on to, because if the family does choose to bury their baby in the cradle, then the keepsake is something that touched their baby, that was present with their baby, and is a reminder of their time together. And some families choose to just keep the entire cradle as a keepsake. And we've heard stories that they'll put it in a shadow box as a memory. We've had a lot of moms actually tell us that they sleep with their cradle because it was the only thing that touched their baby and that was physically present. Because sadly, these families, they never got to put their baby in an outfit. They never got to bring them home or have anything else physically associated with their baby. And the cradle was that and held their baby. And so it's very symbolic to them. And I completely understand that feeling. And so the cradle can really be used either for burial or a keepsake, whichever the family prefers. But that's kind of what the cradles look like. But they have usually either lace or ribbon around the edge of the top of the cradle. And then there's a cross charm that's sewn at the foot of the cradle. And that's on every single cradle. And then we have a little booklet inside that shares with the families about all of the resources that we offer, because we believe that the cradle is a very temporary comfort, that it comforts them in that moment after delivery when they can hold and bond with their baby. But then when they leave the hospital with empty arms and they go back to an empty nursery, the booklet is basically helping them connect to a Christ-centered community where they can listen to our podcast, they can come to our online support groups, read the book. We have a bunch of ebooks on our website that are completely free about how to plan a funeral for a baby, how to handle holidays and milestones like their baby's due date, their baby's heaven day. There's just a lot of different resources that we have for grieving families. And so we want to connect them as soon as possible after they get home from the hospital to these Christ-centered, hope-filled resources that will help them in their grieving and healing journey.
Well, and that's what I love so much about your ministry. The cradles are amazing. And I love that it gives those parents that opportunity to spend time with their baby and take pictures and have a way to hold the baby where the baby's body is safe. And I just love it. I just love it. And then you offer so much more than just the cradles. Like you said, all of those resources that you have available. And people can learn more about those by going to your website, I assume. Yeah.
Yep. It's bridgetscradles.com. And I also have an author website. It's ashleyopliger.com. And something that's special on there is that the book that we've talked about a little bit here is Cradled in Hope. But on my author website, I have a free Cradled in Hope guided journal. And what's special about that is it's basically the companion guide to my book. And it allows you to journal throughout as you're reading the book. Has a lot of all of the scripture that's mentioned in the book. It has that typed out, the full verses. And then it has journaling lines for you to journal. And then it has extra charts and just guidance and resources all worked into the journal. And so that is a free resource on my author website. And we're eventually going to have a printed journal that they can get on Amazon. If you don't want to, type it onto a PDF, you can actually have something to write it down. And that's going to be coming out here soon as well. But those are some of the resources that we offer. We have a Facebook group for grieving parents, specifically for grieving moms. And we do have different events throughout the year for grieving couples. But majority, I would say, of our support groups are specifically for grieving moms.
All right, good. Well, I'm going to put links to all of that in our show notes so people can get connected with you. I do want to talk to you a little bit about your book and the time that we have remaining. I love how you wrote the book. It sounds like you are sitting face to face with another grieving mom, just sitting there having a cup of coffee together, or, in my case, a Diet Coke, since I'm not a coffee drinker, just having a conversation. I just almost picture you knee to knee with another grieving mom. Why did you decide to write it that way?
Well, first of all, I'm honored to meet another non-coffee drinker because I feel like I'm the only weirdo that that does not like coffee or tea. And so I would
Right.
probably have like a frappuccino, or I like lemonade, but so yes, but that is exactly how I intended for the book to feel. So I have the honor of walking through the grieving journey with so many bereaved moms in person. We have a little building in Keachai, Kansas, and that's where our headquarters is. And we do our support groups there. And I've had the honor to just hug a mom when they come in the door and sit right next to them. And as they're tearing up, put my arm around her, pass her the Kleenexes. And that is how I believe ministry should be,
Yeah.
is face to face, one on one, or in a small group, and just really having time to sit and listen and talk and cry together. And that's how our support groups, both in person and online, have been. And so essentially I wanted to take that kind of ministry and put it in a book form, which was pretty hard in the sense of, I just want to be face to face with every single person that's reading it and have the chance to hear her story and talk about her baby. And so in the beginning, there's an introduction. It's called Hugs at the Door. And that's essentially a nod to the fact that if you were coming to our headquarters, that I would be giving you a hug at the door. And essentially, I try to open the book with this idea of let's meet together at this little blue barn building in Keachai, Kansas. Obviously, it's just a hypothetical conversation, but the idea is that I really want to set the stage for we're going to walk through this journey hand in hand. And most importantly, I'm going to point you to Jesus and have you walk hand in hand with him, because obviously, I want my words to be helpful, but he's the only one that can heal your heart. He's the only one that can solve this problem for us, which is the problem of death. And so I hope that that's how readers feel when they open the book, is that they have found a friend that understands them, that knows that I have been where they have been, that I am not afraid to talk about the rawness of grief. I'm sure you picked up on that throughout the book, that I really talk a lot about the questions, the hard theological questions, and the doubts and the wrestling of trying to navigate grief and holding on to faith. And so as I walk through that, I always start each chapter with a story of my own honest reflection of grieving, but then I quickly try to point directly to biblical truth. And then throughout that, just practical guidance and wisdom on practical ways that you can apply it. Because sometimes I think in Christian circles, we're really good at just, giving the truth and then being like, well, that should just solve your problems and you should automatically feel better, without really talking about the struggle. And I'm praying that my book would feel that that is a healthy mix of saying, here's the grief, the sorrow, the pain, but here's the truth. And here's how we can walk this out and ultimately find hope in the midst of such a hopeless situation.
I think you did that very successfully in the book, because I could sure see that was your heart. It just came to me very clearly through the book. And I love how interactive your book is. Like you said, you've got that companion journal. There's little links to, you listen to your podcast here, it goes with this chapter. And I just found your book very helpful for myself, even though my loss is different from yours. And so I can just imagine how helpful it will be for other moms. And I love that you have done that. There's also scripture woven, of course, all throughout your book. Are there any particular verses that have been a lifeline to you in your grief journey? Just a couple of them.
Yeah. So I love Revelation chapters 20 and 21. And in my book, talking about the future forever and the new heaven and the new earth. And that really has been a huge anchor for me in keeping my eyes fixed on eternity. But there's also another verse in chapter 12, and chapter 12 is called More Than Gold, and it's essentially talking about how God can use our grief to sanctify and grow us through our suffering. And essentially the whole chapter is based on the book of First Peter, but I'm going to read First Peter chapter 1, verses 6-7, which is the inspiration behind the title More Than Gold. So it says, on that day you will be glad, even if you have to go through many hard trials for a while. Your faith will be like gold that has been tested in a fire. And these trials will prove that your faith is worth much more than gold that can be destroyed. They will show you that you will be given praise and honor and glory when Jesus Christ returns. And so I just love the perspective that, and it's all throughout the Bible. You see it all throughout the Bible, the link between suffering and glory, the link between persevering through trials and the character that's building up in us, and eventually the character that leads to hope. And I share a lot of Bible verses specifically in that chapter that share the link between suffering and glory, and how God uses the things that we walk through on this earth to sanctify us and to grow us more like Christ. And ultimately, when he does a work through us, which is the sanctification, eventually that heart change leads to the fruit and the harvest of us using that grief for good. And so the following chapter after this is a chapter about God using our pain for a purpose. And I think that that doesn't happen until we've had the internal transformation of God working through us. And so I just love that in First Peter, of God talking about how this suffering is actually worth more than anything, because it produces in us faith. And faith, if you think about it, faith is the precursor to salvation, that we have faith in Jesus and we believe in him, and he gives us his free gift of salvation. And that is the greatest gift that we could ever have, is knowing that our eternity is secure and that we'll one day live in a good and perfect paradise with Jesus himself, which is the glory and the splendor of heaven. But then as a secondary gift, we have the reunion with our family and our babies and loved ones in Christ. And to me, that is just where I try to keep my focus when I feel so hopeless and I feel so sad. It's been almost 11 years since I carried Bridget, and it's been over a year since I've heard my dad's voice. And sometimes that feeling of like getting further and further away from the time that you carried your baby, or you got to spend time with your loved one or child, it feels more hopeless, because it's like, in some ways the grief is getting worse, because it's like, I miss them even more. It's been so long since I've seen them, and that can feel very suffocating and overwhelming. It's like every day is one day further out from them. But the promise of eternity is that every day is one step and one day closer to them. And I write a lot about Jesus's second coming in my book, and we probably don't have time to go into all of that right now, but I really have just lived in a place where I'm just longing for him to come back and longing to be with him. It doesn't mean that I'm suicidal, that I'm wishing death upon myself, but I think it's very biblical to long for heaven, because that's where God made us and intended for us to live. And that is our citizenship. That is where we are heading for. And I think it makes sense, as people who are made for eternity, who are living in a very broken earth, to long for that and to desire to be in his presence. And I certainly feel that in my soul, that I'm homesick for heaven and I can't wait to be there. But at the same point, I do understand that God has a reason for me to be here, and I want to live out my days with urgency to share the gospel and to comfort others, even when I'm hurting myself. Like I'm actively grieving right now.
Yes.
It's still just in me, just this fire that God's given me to say, even in this pain, like I want it to be used for good, and I want to use the story and the testimony that God's writing in my life, even though I don't like my story. Like, I would have written it very differently, and I would have changed a lot of parts, and I would have crossed out all the parts that were, difficult, and I would have had everything go differently. But at the same point, I look at it and I say, well, God has used all of this, the sum of my life experiences, to mold me into who he wants me to be, which is more like him. And I've not arrived. I'm not a perfect Christian by any means. There's still things that he's working on in my walk. But I think that as we go through life, that he will use those things if we allow him to, if we surrender our suffering to him. He will use those things for good. And it doesn't mean that it's a pleasant process. It's often very painful. And so when I say these things, like it's sometimes I think we can hear people say like, oh, just use your, pain for a purpose. And it's like, yeah, but it is a painful process in the midst of it. And it doesn't negate that. But there is so much healing that comes from allowing God to use it, because you see, okay, yes, he is redeeming this. He has a plan and it's good. And one day when I'm with him in heaven, I'm going to see the full picture.
Amen. Ashley, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for that reminder that even though it's hard, even though every day we miss our kids, I know you miss your dad, but there is purpose in it, and there is redemption. And I'm thankful for that. So I appreciate the reminder. Thank you so much for joining me. And I've enjoyed this opportunity to get to know you and to hear about Bridget's Cradles. All of the links will be in the show notes. And I look forward to hopefully meeting you in person one day.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. What a privilege it's been to spend this time with Ashley, hearing Bridget's story and learning how God used one tiny cradle to launch a ministry that now serves families across the nation. I'm so thankful for the way Ashley points us back to Jesus, even in the midst of sorrow, and for the reminder that he can bring redemption and purpose from our deepest pain. I hope you'll take some time to explore the resources Ashley mentioned today. You'll find all the links to those in the show notes. And if this conversation has been meaningful to you, would you consider sharing this episode with a friend who may need it? You can also rate or review the While We're Waiting podcast to help other grieving parents discover these stories of hope. I'd also like to personally invite you to attend one of our free While We're Waiting weekends for bereaved parents. You can find all the upcoming dates and locations on our website at www.whilewe'rewaiting.org. We'd love to have the opportunity to serve you at one of these special events when the time is right for you. I hope this week's episode of the podcast has encouraged you as you seek to live well while you're waiting.